Back program. Tonight is an episode that you want to DVR and you want to watch with your kids. I'll explain in a bit. Tonight, it's America's civil rights history. You know about the great heroes like MLK, you know about Rosa Parks, you know everything you probably need to know or even want to know about the true evils of slavery. You know that it's one of the worst scars on a republic, and you know it still tears us apart. You know all of those things are true, and you know they're right. In essence, when it comes to civil rights, you know that it is a cake. You know this is a cake. No one's trying to convince you that it's anything other than a cake. But tonight, I want to try to add to your understanding of what this cake tastes like, what made it up, what the layers are of this cake, so you can truly understand. Our great country is in trouble, and you have to understand how the cake is made. Our country has done some absolutely horrific things. But it's like this cake, it's yummy. And since it's made by the cake boss, yeah, it's great living by New York. You can call the cake boss and get a good cake. You know, then, that this cake is pretty much perfect. But is that true? What's true? You have to cut the cake, if I can, and take it out and look at it. You have to see, could I have a plate? You have to see all the layers of this particular cake. So you can see the layers of the past. How is this made up? What layer is good, what layer is bad, and what are the ingredients so we'll know in the future? So things won't happen like that again. But I warn you, some of the images that you're going to see tonight and tomorrow, especially I think tomorrow, will be disturbing. If you have young children, DVR the show, watch it, and then watch it again later with them. But watch it first yourself. We have 400 years to cover, so this is by no means a complete history. It's to get you into it. 400 years to cover, so let's get started. Okay. Hello, America. In case I haven't been clear already, I want you to know this is not the end-all and be-all on civil rights and what happened in America. We have 2 hours and 400 years. We have tonight and tomorrow. The goal is just to open your eyes and show you history like you've never heard or seen it before. Then you have to do your own research. You know, I am not a history teacher, but a good history teacher, I've always felt, will just get you excited about history, get you into the stories, and then make you want to read yourself. Exercise the American knowledge muscle that I told you about yesterday. Thomas Jefferson said, and this is important, if a nation expects to be ignorant and free in a state of civilization, it expects what never was and never will be. You cannot take my word for these things tonight. You can't listen to the Huffington Post or anything else. You can't take the words of textbooks. You must do your own homework. This is your country. This is your history. Read, and read people who disagree with each other. Listen to me, read the things I tell you, and then go check it out on your own. Go read somebody who vehemently disagrees. You find the truth. It's imperative for the Republic. Yesterday, talked to you a little bit about manifest destiny and how manifest destiny is a perversion of divine providence and how the 4 major forces, these, commerce, religion, government, and science, they're all good. But when they collude, there is trouble. All of these forces turned against the Native Americans, as we showed you last night, after initially recognizing their sovereignty. Our founders liked the Native Americans. But then we needed land. Government needed to expand. We needed to make money on it. Religion was telling people, well, they're savages. They're savages. They're not quite as whole. They're sons of Noah. Same thing with science. They colluded, all for the goal of making money or the best for the collective. Well, tonight, I want to take you over here. Let me bring over here on 3. I want to bring you over here. I'm going to bring you into the 17th century. We're going to talk a little bit about slavery. We all learned about slavery in school. We all know the horrors of it. I mean, I remember watching Roots as a kid and thinking, oh my gosh. The fact that whites enslaved blacks in this country, built on the idea of all men being created equal, is beyond hypocritical. We know that. So how did it happen? We know that it's a national tragedy. We also know the treasure that is Abraham Lincoln. We know how it ended with the Civil War. But I asked the other day when we were in these meetings, does anybody know how slavery started? We know the ending. How did it start? I mean, nobody came in and said, hey, everybody, let's have slaves. That doesn't sound like that could happen. The real insidiousness lies in the fact that it all started small and advanced into one of the worst scars in American history and global history. I mean, it's a human atrocity. And it's happened time and time again. At first, slavery wasn't full-blown slavery. In fact, in the early colonial America, it wasn't slavery. It was indentured servitude. Now, what is indentured servitude? Well, indentured servitude is not the same as slavery. I mean, there's some important differences here. In fact, I think it shares many of the same things. Where are we over here? It shares many of the same things that we have in common with today's illegal immigration. I believe that illegal immigration is modern-day slavery. I've said that on the program before, but that's not quite right. Illegal immigration, the way it's happening now, is more like indentured servitude. For instance, if you're an illegal and you're working here in New York, you're barely getting paid enough to rent a bed, not a room, a bed, for 8 hours. Somebody else is going to rent that same bed for the next 8 hours. You have enough time to go sleep in it, and then you got to go back to being at the mercy of your employer. You don't have any real rights. The government's not going to help you. Nobody's going to help you because you don't exist. You're not in the records. In theory, indentured servitude is like that, but indentured servitude promised a light at the end of the tunnel. Because after your contract with the master was up, you got what were called at the time freedom dues. That was usually a little bit of land and a gun. Most important part of freedom dues was freedom. Indentured servitude was a common practice throughout the globe at the time. The English, the Spanish, the Portuguese, everybody was using this indentured servitude. It was like slavery, but not quite, and it's not an American problem. It's a human problem that happened all over the world. Now, there were criteria on which people were used as early indentured servants. But here's what's not taught. If I said to you, was it a white man or a black man that was the master and the indentured servant, you would say it was like this. But the criteria at the beginning was not based on color. It was based on creed. It was non-Christians that were used as servants. Colonists didn't identify themselves as white. They identified themselves as Englishmen or Christians. Whites, blacks, you name it. They were all used for this earliest form of slavery. In fact, if an indentured servant broke a contract, they got the same punishment regardless of color. I mean, if this guy was the owner, this guy ran away, same thing as if this guy ran away. It was Christianity. That's how it was. And if you were Christian, you just said, I accept Jesus, you could get out. I honestly don't know why more people didn't say, I accept Jesus. You really didn't want to do it. Now, this is bad, but this isn't slavery. How did it happen? Nudge. A shift, a slight shift, bit by bit. We shifted, we nudged, we moved just a little bit from servitude to slavery. But how? Well, here's Massachusetts, the first colony to legalize and recognize slavery. Other states soon followed. Why? Because it was profitable, like Virginia. Now, do you know who owned the first state-sponsored slave in America? Who owned? Who was this guy? It puts a slave. You know who it was? His name was Anthony Johnson, except he wasn't a white man. He, believe it or not, was a black man. You ever heard that? How did a black man own a black man? Well, let's start with him. Before he was an owner, what was he? He was an indentured servant. He was a black indentured servant, not a slave. He worked in Virginia, 1621. It's recorded in the census. His name was Antonio. It just recorded his first name and his race. Well, he wasn't considered a slave. He was an indentured servant. He decided that he was going to become an owner. He changed his name to Anthony Johnson. And in 1640, Anthony and his wife bought a plot of land and hired, not slaves, because there weren't slaves yet, he hired indentured servants. Got it? Now, that same year, in another place, there was another guy. Anthony was doing all these things. There was a court case involving 3 indentured servants who had escaped. There were 3. And there's 2 white guys and a black guy. Got it? This is different than Anthony, who was over here. Now, these guys ran away. They escaped. They were caught. Well, 2 of them had their servitude extended by 4 years, and the third one had it extended for life. Can you guess which one got life? Which means you no longer can buy your freedom, so you in effect become a slave. It was this one. Are you asking the same question I asked? Why did these guys only get 4 years and this guy get life? Oldest story of time. This was the beginning of slavery. He was black. This is the beginning of the real nightmare that took a long time to get out. Now, back here, these guys are over here. Here's Anthony again. He's got his indentured servant. Well, Anthony's slave was John Castor. John Castor, who was also black, complained to a court that Anthony had unfairly extended his terms of servitude. The court emancipated Castor and said, "You're a free man, you can go." But Anthony went back and he tried to convince a court that Castor belonged to him and should be his for life. He won the court case, believe it or not. He won the court case and he became a slave. Do we have it? He became a slave. The first one. I tell you this story to show you that it's a human problem. It doesn't matter. It's not a white condition or a black condition. It's a human condition. Man will enslave any man when he can. This is a warning sign. It has happened throughout history. It's one of the layers of cake. Wait a minute. Everyone can do it. Do you know where the word slave came from? It actually came from the word Slav. Slav. The Slavic people in Central Europe. They were enslaved during the Middle Ages. Every time they'd lose a war, everybody would round them up and enslave them. Slav. Slavery. It didn't become race until much, much later. Now, this is horrible. But it's about to really go off the tracks. How did we go even more wrong than we already are? You'll always have to come back to the formula. Watch for this formula. When they collude, you're in trouble. Commerce, religion, government, and science. Got to go to tobacco. Tobacco, worth a lot of money. It was a skill set that the English were familiar with, but they weren't good at it at all. The people who were good at it were the indentured servants. They spent their whole time doing it, and they had a chance to buy their way out if they could do it well. Yet the colonies depended on this, depended on it. Just like they tell us now we're dependent on illegal immigrants. I mean, if they can make your tobacco cheaper or your salad cheaper, believe me, there will always be somebody that will take advantage of it. So, at the time, the colonies were struggling economically, so the pressure started to mount to produce more tobacco and more tobacco, more tobacco. There's a crisis. Sound familiar? At the same time, the colonies argued that freeing the indentured servants was causing a problem. It was a threat to property owners. They said that it was too costly. They couldn't keep up. These guys would leave, and then commerce would be hurt because there was so much turnover, and they had to spend too much money, which made tobacco more expensive, which hurt the economy. So restrictions started being placed. Because commerce was hurt, government stepped in, put more restrictions on. They placed restrictions on owning land. Well, that caused the indentured servants to become upset because, wait a minute, that's our way out. Well, these guys started taking to the streets and setting fires. Of course, instead of this moving the colonies to reject the horrific nature of servitude and move towards freedom, because people's dollars were at stake, they went the other way. You know what's strange here is I think this is actually our first Tea Party. The master was taking too much from the everyday people. It's the first time we saw the attitude of manifest destiny as well. That they could do anything. They can take the land from the servants. In 1662, Virginia took one of the last steps on the road to true evil. They enacted a law that said all children born into the colony to a slave mother would be enslaved. So now, not only were you a slave for the rest of your life, but now that slave passed it on from generation to generation, all based on color. By the way, let's go back here to Anthony Johnson. How did it end for Anthony Johnson? The freed, not slave, but the freed indentured servant, who then was an owner of another black man. He died in 1670. This is the record of it. This is about his land. What happened to his land? Jury had to decide it. The land Johnson left behind, they decided, could be seized by the government. Could be seized by the government. Because he was, quote, by consequence, an alien. That's why all men are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Because this guy used the government to give him the right to own another person. Why? Because it was good for the government. They needed money. It was good for commerce. They needed money. So the government granted him a right because it was good for the collective. A government can give, and a government can take away. The first servitude, then an extended punishment, then a crisis, then people born into slavery. Bit by bit, law by law, we progressed from horrible system of indentured servitude based on religion to an even worse one based solely on color. A little tweak here, a little tweak there, a nudge here, a nudge there. During a crisis, each time that nudge takes us down a little farther the road. That's why you must stop and ask yourself, not just what kind of change are we talking about, but what lies at the end of the road? If we just keep being nudged, where does it lead us? All of this evolved into the monstrous system of slavery that we're all familiar with from our history books. An entire race of people brutally enslaved by slave owners, empowered by the government. It is today this nation's deepest scar. A lot of our problems started here. It's our most grotesque national tragedy. But again, this is just scratching the surface. Do your own digging. Get the full history. You need to find out what you truly believe in, what this country is really about. Are we just about slavery? Is this the scar? The commerce, the government, the science, the crisis of tobacco dragged us deeper and deeper into slavery. But here's the part you also have to learn. What began to drag us out? That's next. All right, tonight we're trying to show you just some of the layers of this cake. Oh, the cake boss. I love you. I watch your show all the time. Some of the layers of this cake that make up our history. If you can squeeze in, you see that it's not what you might expect. Our civil rights history. It's not just one layer. You've got to know the things that led to the horrible disaster that was slavery, and then the things that happened that eventually culminated in the civil rights movement. But we're not done yet. We're never done on this. I believe you have to look at what these institutions are saying and doing to get an indication of where we're going, where we're headed. Because this is a common theme that has happened since the beginning of time. Commerce, religion, government, and science. If you look at them, you'll see patterns throughout history. And the patterns that need to be avoided involve collusion. It is the only way to prevent the evil that comes from a combination of these. You got to look when they start to collude. Everything from slavery to eugenics and genocide comes from the collusion of these things. They collude when there is a loss of individual rights because there's a crisis or there's a problem. They start to talk together and then the whole thing falls apart. Hopefully, America will avoid repeating the past mistakes. We've done it every single time we've pulled ourselves out. Now, I just showed you how some of these factors steered us into the deeper disaster of slavery. But now, how do we get out of slavery? It didn't happen with Abraham Lincoln. It just wasn't like, hey, let's stop slavery. Once we got waist deep into the quicksand of slavery, how did we climb out of it? Well, there are a few key things that helped us starting to get on the right track. But again, these things, they start to change and they start moving in the other direction. I've told you on the show before, we've talked a lot about George Whitefield. We've talked about him on the program quite a bit. He took trips from England and went through all the colonies, and he preached to anybody who would listen. While he was in the U.S., he sees that the colonists are becoming more and more materialistic. They wanted all kinds of imported stuff, candlesticks and all kinds of stuff. Glassware. And this is Wedgwood china. Ooh. Well, Whitefield sees Wedgwood, I'm pretty sure it was the blue and white stuff, but he sees Wedgwood china. And he says, oh my gosh, America's on the wrong track. This is the golden calf. This, because people were thinking about the refined things in life. He realizes that America is losing touch with the Puritan lifestyle. Here you go, Aaron. And he knows that they got to get back to God. Now, understand that slavery and equal rights and humans are complex. Sometimes a good guy can also be a bad guy. Whitefield, he actually helped bring more slavery to America. He encouraged slavery at one point in his life. So how is he a good guy? Well, through his preaching, Whitefield reminded people of who the true arbiter of freedom was. God, not man, God. Whitefield planted the seeds, and those seeds would eventually bear fruit. Meanwhile, back in England, the guy who makes the china, Josiah Wedgwood, the pottery guy, he's living it up as the head of this uber-successful company. Well, now, Wedgwood is an abolitionist. He's also a Quaker. Religion. Religion is starting to pull away from commerce and government. It goes back to religion again. By the beginning of the American Revolution, Quakers had moved from viewing slavery as a matter of individual choice to seeing the abolition of slavery as a Christian duty. The Quaker-led Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade met in London in 1787. 3 of the members designed a seal to be engraved for the use of the society. This is it. This is the seal. Guess who made it? The guy who makes the china, Josiah Wedgwood. Prominent member of the group. He mass markets this seal. It was arguably the most famous image of a black person in all of the 1700s. Wedgwood, the medallion, read, Am I not a man and a brother? This image was reproduced on everything from bracelets to cigar boxes, everything. It was like, you know what it is? It's like the Lance Armstrong bracelet of the day. It was a flashpoint. It was a wake-up call for the abolitionists. 1740. Government and religion now start to come apart. 1640, they collude to bring slavery. Whitefield comes, starts to wake people up, put religion back in its rightful place, pull it away from commerce and government and science. Commerce starts to pull away as well with Wedgwood, his wealth. He starts to fight against slavery, and the wheels begin to turn again. You can see that these things can be used for good when they're starting to question each other, and evil when they collude. One image was the symbol for a generation. Just like people and the Republicans and the Democrats. You can't always say that Democrats are always right, Republicans are always wrong. It doesn't work. People try to do their best. And people also change through generations. You can't say, you can't say this guy was bad, but you can't say he was all good either. You can't say Wedgwood. Wedgwood, well, the Wedgwood name, what does the Wedgwood name mean? Wedgwood family inspires abolitionist with the medallion. 2 generations later, his great-grandson plants the seed that leads to progressivism, eugenics. You know who Wedgwood's grandson was? Charles Darwin, the father of modern-day racism. Back in a minute. There is a fight in this nation on whether America is good or bad, good or evil. Are we oppressors or are we victims? What are we? We're a little of everything, quite honestly, because we're people. You got to know what you believe. And America's it's not sunshine and lollipops. But no country is. The Republicans aren't the greatest. The Democrats aren't the greatest. They're not the worst. They switch places all the time. But it's a whitewashing of history that bothers me. How has the Democratic Party assumed the mantle of defender of minorities if you know their early history? Come with me. Dating to Andrew Jackson. This is the 17th century. We've taken you so rapidly. Again, I tell you that this is not complete history. This is just touching on some of the stuff that you don't know. And tomorrow we're going to take you into the 50s and 60s and it'll blow your mind what you don't know. But again, not complete history. You've got to fill in all of the rest of it. Democrats like Andrew Jackson passed things like this, the Indian Removal Act. It is what it sounds like. It was a removal of Indians from the United States, just moving them someplace else, either willingly or by force. The removal of Native Americans through the Indian Removal Act, which Jackson signed into law in 1830, wasn't a problem for him because it's manifest destiny. We told you about this last night. It's a perversion of divine providence. It's the belief that America is destined, bestowed by God, to spread across North America. Now, if you believe that America is destined to be a shining city on the hill, a shining example, a blessing to the world, not by force, I'm with you. But if you're destined to break every treaty we made, the ends justify the means, wipe out entire populations, and we're given that right by God, you're out of your mind. Don't get me wrong. The Whigs initially opposed the concept of manifest destiny. It was the Democrats and the Whigs. But both of them did it. Both of them. Both of them helped along the way, and they both helped prolong slavery. So why is it now that so many people believe that the government would be the key to solving all of our racial problems in this country? It's the government that enslaved people in the first place. It was the government that lied to, wiped out the Indians. How is it all of a sudden the government is the good guy? That they're the answer to everything that's a problem? Why is it difficult for Americans to get their heads around where the real solutions come from? People! And it usually starts in church. In the 1800s, reform started in the churches. Remember, I told you this. Reform starts with this guy. Not a good guy entirely. And then it just takes off. Well, people knew that they couldn't continue to enslave other human beings and be right with God. Now, some people would put their head in the sand just like today. Some people, you're like, what? How are you doing this? Even before independence, Quakers and many other religious groups had argued that slavery was incompatible with the teachings of Christ. Our founders did the same thing. But it goes into the 1800s. The 1800s. 1835, the Ohio Anti-Slavery Society in Zanesville holds its first meeting. Now, these are religious whites who are vehemently opposed to slavery. And by the 1840s, Ohio abolitionists like Levi Coffin helped thousands of slaves escape to freedom on what you now know as the Ohio Underground Railroad. Harriet Tubman. Remember that one? You know Harriet Tubman, you read about her, but do you know everything else around it? She's a devout Christian. She's one of the best-known conductors of the Underground Railroad. This woman is a hero, miraculous. She not only escaped, she went back in and escorted 300 slaves to freedom. If I'm not mistaken, I hate to speak out, I think she went back for her husband, and her husband was with another woman, and she's like, you're staying there, and she moved on. She was born into slavery in Maryland. She married a free slave, escaped to the north, risked everything, returned back to the South to save her family members. Then there's Harriet Beecher Stowe. Not only wrote about the experiences like Uncle Tom's Cabin and Trails of Slaves, but she and her husband, Calvin Stowe, a professor of biblical literature, sheltered slaves in their own home. Now, many people have probably already put this part together, but Ohio was not predominantly black. In fact, it was quite the opposite. So wait a minute. So now white people aren't all bad. It was the religious white people that woke up the nation of the rest of the white people as saying, what are you doing? It was the realization that this was wrong, and that the two parties, weren't doing anything about it. They weren't going to stop this. The government wouldn't stop it because of commerce. And science was backing them up. So somebody suggested a new movement. A new party, a third party, if you will, destroyed the Whigs. It was called the Republican Party. The Republican Party doesn't mean then what it means now. The name was chosen because it alluded to equality, reminded people of Thomas Jefferson and his Democratic Republican Party, small government. In 1860, the first Republican is elected, Abraham Lincoln. Firmly established the new party as a major political party in the United States. Because the other two weren't doing anything, another one came in and said, get out of our way, we'll do it. A party that was very much libertarian at the time. The party and president that brought the abolition of slavery. Now you'd think that you might hear that from time to time in the political discourse, but you don't. The secular humanists, the Democrats who believed in social justice, No, they took the nation by the hand, all the while fighting rich, white, Republican racists tooth and nail, and they don't talk about that. Led the nation down a path to Emancipation Proclamation. No, none of that could be further from the truth. It's this guy. And it's a group of religious people that finally say, you know what? Nobody's going to do anything, so we will. There are plenty of struggles and bloodshed along the path. And while the Civil War has been well chronicled, I'm going to share just a couple of stories with you before we end tonight and pick it up tomorrow around 1900 that I don't think you're familiar with. And that's coming up next. I know the Civil War has been covered a lot, but there's one part that you should know, and that you may not. This is a great book. You should read this. The book is called Giants. It's about Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass was a slave who escaped and then finds his way to Abraham Lincoln. The two of them become very good friends. Douglass becomes the first black man to attend an inauguration of the White House. And he talks about Lincoln. Douglass said about Lincoln, I was never more quickly more completely put at ease in the presence of a great man than that of Abraham Lincoln. When Douglass met with Lincoln again in August of 1864, Lincoln asked him to, in case the war wasn't a total Union victory, to prepare an effort to assist slaves escaping to the North. Well, prior to the meeting with Lincoln, Douglass had turned on the Constitution, and he had preached against the Constitution. He actually said that the U.S. Constitution was a slave document. Have you heard that today? Now here he is, an educated man, one of the most prominent men of the time, but he took it for granted, apparently listening to what others said about the Constitution, and he bought in. Well, then he actually read the Constitution himself. And afterwards, this is what he said. Frederick Douglass, quote, the Constitution of the United States could not well have been designed at the same time to maintain and perpetuate a system of rapine and murder like slavery, especially as not one word could be found in the Constitution to authorize such a belief. Frederick Douglass understood then that what the Constitution, what it was trying to do, when it was applied properly, that it would be the key to freedom for all men. The conclusion of this story next. This is part 2 of the 3-part series, and we are leaving it here with this kind of idea. I'm only 3/5 a man. Frederick Douglass. I just told you that Frederick Douglass at first believed that about the Constitution, and then he read it. And then he read the Federalist Papers. He realized the Constitution was not a slave document after he looked into it, and he read it, and he read the Federalist Papers, and he understood the 3/5 clause. It dealt with representation, not a man's worth. Again, take it from Frederick Douglass in his own words. They framed the Constitution plainly with a view to the speedy downfall of slavery. They carefully excluded from the Constitution any and every word which could lead to the belief that they meant it for persons of only one complexion. That is Frederick Douglass, a hero, a former slave. He had that realization in 1863. How? He came to the conclusion that our founders were not rich, evil, selfish white men who just wanted to oppress people of color. They wanted to set them free. 147 years later, we are still retreading what he set right. How have we arrived at this place after so much we've been through together? After so much blood shed for freedom? So many from all races, risking and sacrificing so much, from all races doing the wrong thing and all races doing the right thing. Well, it takes us here. It takes us here to 1900. And we'll show you how we got from there to here tomorrow.